right.
Thank you for coming, especially despite the cold, given that you're in shorts. That's a brave and courageous move.
It's a beautiful day today, indoors.
It's a beautiful day somewhere else. But so with 6 million people on Slack now, that's a lot of people who are slacking instead of emailing. And it's also a lot of people sending animated GIFs instead of maybe getting their work done. But you guys have found a really funny solution to how to keep people from being too distracted at work in the form of an emoji. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about that cute little quirk you guys have come up with.
Yeah, sure. So I think emoji have been a really interesting part of the kind of history and evolution of Slack. And I think that, regardless of kind of what happened with Slack, emoji have been gradually taking over, kind of all human language since they were, introduced to us with smartphones. And I think that they filled this interesting gap in density of communication. The idea of one of the downsides of email is that you have this huge amount of structure around every bit of communication that you send. You have the subject line, you have a greeting, maybe depending on culture, you have a how are you doing, how are your kids, the kind of little nugget of the information that you're trying to get across, and then a sign off or maybe a footer that says, please save the trees, don't print this off, company confidential, here's my fax number.
If you're printing your emails, by the way, please stop.
And there's this massive envelope of information that sits around the little core of communication. And information density, if you're working on some kind of small team and you're trying to collaborate a bunch, is hugely important. The people that you exchange hundreds of messages with every day to kind of get the core of your job done, the density of that communication really matters. And I think emoji are a really interesting lesson in condensing that down into its smallest form. Instead of sending an email that says, yes, I think this is a great idea, you can just react with a little thumbs up or a plus or a check mark or a thumbs down or a poop or whatever whatever within your team means yes or no or other signals.
But I know that sometimes people just get off topic when they're talking in such an informal format as Slack. With email, you feel like, OK, everything has to be really professional. But on Slack, you're sending animated GIFs, you're sending emoji. So how do you handle when people at Slack get off topic and are kind of distracting each other?
Yeah, we have I don't know how it came about, but internally we have this idea of the polite raccoon. I genuinely have no idea where it came from. That's you should move this discussion to another channel. And initially it would be people posted a GIF of a raccoon and said, please move this discussion. And now it's internally just a verb. You're raccooning somebody by you respond to something with the raccoon emoji, and that means go take this offline to a different channel.
So I have to say that one thing that I do really like about email is that I can ignore it till the next morning. Whereas with Slack, there seems to be a bit of pressure to respond in real time. So you guys built these do not disturb settings where you can make it so somebody's message gets rejected and they're told to send it later, or they can interrupt you if they really need to. I wanted to ask, what are your personal do not disturb settings? When do you turn that on?
Yeah, I think it's with Slack, like with any new technology that ends up being widely adopted, it takes some time for kind of the cultural norms to develop around how people are going to use these tools. Similar to, in some companies, it would be weird to get email from your boss at 3 a.m. and other companies that's totally normal. And then there's an expectation or not as to whether you respond. And I think that's less about the tool itself and more around the cultural expectations of your organization. So I think within Slack, my do not disturb is, overnight, whatever the default settings are, probably 6 to 6 a.m. I'm in do not disturb mode. And I think that that's fairly normal. That's the settings that come out of the box. And that's a pretty healthy way for teams to communicate. That kind of separation of, work-life balance and making sure you can leave your job when you, leave your work behind when you leave at the end of the day is definitely important to us as just a company culture, regardless of the tool, something that we feel pretty strongly about. And I think both in the do not disturb settings that we've built and the tools around those and warning people if they're going to send an @ channel to hundreds of people across multiple time zones, those kind of features in the product have been important. And I think there's definitely a lot more we can do in terms of kind of freeing up people's time so that they can have a better separation between work and outside of work. So a lot of the stuff that we're doing around, sorry, this has turned into a very long answer to a simple question, but a lot of the stuff that we're doing around machine learning is very much about kind of making people more efficient. So there's been a lot of research over the last few years about how knowledge workers, information workers spend their time. And the basic result is that people spend a huge amount of the time searching for information inside organizations that already exists. So there's answers to questions that have been answered before, that there's documents around, or even just searching for the right person to ask a question to. You know, it can be something as simple as like, how do I file expenses? And how do I find out what my time off policy is? Or who is responsible for this project? Or when was it delivered? Or what were the revenue numbers on this date? And so one of the things that we're trying to do with Slack is use the kind of growing corpus of knowledge that you build as you use the product with a team, along with machine learning, to be able to answer some of those questions more efficiently, let people cut out that kind of piece of their job that humans are good at, but machines can be good at too, and isn't a uniquely human part of the experience, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I wonder if you're going offline at about 6 p.m. each day, do you ever feel like you're kind of abandoning your team?
I guess that's an interesting question. And you know, with an organization that is global around the world, whenever you're offline, there's somebody who's working at that time. I think it's pretty healthy to set some kind of boundaries. This. I really like working at Slack, the company. It's a place I'd like to still be working at a decade from now, and I'd like people to be able to have a long-term sustainable career while they're there, and that means striking some kind of balance. You know, we don't want people to burn out after a year because they're just constantly always on, responding to messages whenever they come in.
Yeah, I think a lot of companies get that wrong. They think that the best thing they can do is just drive their employees to be as efficient and productive as possible, but in the end, especially with people in the tech industry jumping between jobs every 9 months or year and a half, you end up accelerating that if you're pushing people a bit too hard. But I wonder, what is the company setting overall for all of Slack employees? Is that like 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. do not disturb, a general policy, or does each person set that for themselves? Like, is Slack the tool supposed to set that, or is that a company themselves?
I think the tool is just a facilitator of the company culture. So there has to be, you can use computers to augment a lot of human, sociological problems, but it's really down to what your company's culture is and the expectations you set around that. If you set an expectation that people are working constantly all night, then regardless of the tools you're using, that's going to be reflected, especially more junior people at your company. So it's up to the management team to kind of set the tone of how people work together.
But do you think that the tool influences that? With email, I think it felt like, yes, you could send any time, but no, people aren't necessarily going to respond at any time. Whereas with Slack, it feels like maybe there's a little bit less pressure to send at any time because of the do not disturb, but at the same time, people are kind of encouraged to respond much more quickly because it's an instant messaging feature.
I mean, maybe. I think it's that as a new tool gets adopted, it takes some time for people to understand what the cultural norms around that should be. When we first had email, our relationship to it was very different than it is now. Email feels a lot more ignorable now than it did 5 or 10 years ago. And I think it's going to take some time for us to understand how messaging in the workplace really fits with company culture.
Now we're seeing some governments actually step in to try to regulate how that works in company culture. In France, they just implemented in January a right to disconnect law, which says that after work hours, you're not actually allowed to email employees. Would you vote for that law?
I don't think that would. It doesn't feel like a very American law. It feels like a very French law. So I don't think it would fly very well in Silicon Valley. But I definitely support the intent behind it. That for people to have a sustainable work culture, you need to be able to disconnect.
So do you think, so the problem with that law, though, is that it just regulates email, which is a pretty narrow band of workplace communication. Do you think that Slack should fall under that kind of law? If you're going to regulate workplace communication in the first place, should Slack fall under that?
It just seems the trend of regulation that it arrives about 40 years after the technology that it's regulating. So sometime around 2050, I expect to see some Slack-specific regulation. And by then, we'll have a much better understanding of how it's used in the workplace.
Well, hopefully you'll be around by then. But I want to talk a little bit about international expansion. So you guys recently expanded into Japan, which is known for strict hierarchies, formality, this kind of lack of transparency. So what happened when you went into Japan, where Slack is pretty antithetical to the local norms?
Yeah, I think that's true. You know, like that definitely historically it's been a lot more formal. You know, you talk to your manager talks to their manager, and that's how information is transmitted. So until a couple of weeks ago, Slack was not available in Japanese. We just launched into Japanese, but Japan is our third biggest country and our biggest country of non-English speakers. And I think it is because Slack has allowed teams that have adopted it to kind of transcend that traditional kind of communication boundaries and allow teams to work together a lot more closely. So has really been picked up by Japanese companies that wanted tighter collaboration. There's been this big shift in Japan towards a focus on more healthy work-life balance, because Japan has historically been a culture of intense work ethic, like to the detriment to a lot of the workers. And I think that being able to adopt tools that make teams work more closely together, really enhance collaboration, has been super helpful there. So we've seen a lot of uptick. I think all kinds of knowledge work, all kinds of information work ends up being a team sport. Like the idea that even in software that you have like the lone hacker who like sits in their basement like coding away for years and then comes up for air and it's like, I've made the perfect startup. That's not what actually happens in real life. Everything we do is a team sport. And so the tighter teams can collaborate when they build, then the more efficient people become.
So it sounds like what you're telling me is a bit of that Slack is just a tool. Companies need to set their own culture.
I think that's true of any tool, but there's definitely a set of behaviors that it enables, a set of things that it makes easier, and a set of things it makes harder. So I think that whether we had built Slack or not, some tool like Slack would have come around about now. There's been a few different factors, environmental factors that have changed. One has been the rise of consumer messaging. So it would be pretty weird right now to email with your friends to organize a night out, because you have iMessage, you have WhatsApp, Facebook Messenger, WeChat, or Line. And those tools are just so much better for kind of fast collaboration and communication. Along with the rise of the smartphone, has changed generally how people communicate. And then at the same time, we've seen this proliferation of business software over the last few years. So whereas a decade or more ago, a company would have bought all of its software from a big vendor like an Oracle or an SAP, now any company of any size is buying software and services from tens or hundreds of different vendors, especially with SaaS.
Sure.
And there has been this kind of lack of center to business computing for a little while. So in the past, that would have been, your operating system. Like you buy all these apps and they all run on Windows. Mm-hmm. But with the rise of SaaS in the cloud, and with also the rise of kind of smartphones and bring your own device, there has been this lack of a center for business software. And I think communication is really the only obvious place that can tie those applications together.
Sure.
So I think something like Slack would have existed if we hadn't built it.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. But I think with having so many different tools that enterprises are now contracting, it seems like they're being very much influenced by these outside factors, these tools that have their own norms and their own feature sets that impact their workplace culture. But I think over time, we've seen that really big companies and these big software providers go through a few phases in the lifespan of their company. First they think they're just a utility, and then they think, we're making everything better. We're making things more open, we're making things more transparent, we're making things more connected. But most recently, we've seen some of these really big companies go through that, okay, we've caused some unintended consequences phase. Now we're seeing Facebook and Google and Twitter go under congressional hearings about how Russian election interference happened and how fake news is affecting the discourse of the country. I wanted to know, what do you think are some of the unintended consequences of Slack?
I think that's an interesting question. I think we're in a pretty different space because we're not a consumer product, so that at least moves us out of the line of.
You guys are definitely a consumer product. I definitely use it with friends outside my enterprise, so it affects every part of culture. So, but what do you think are the unintended consequences?
I think that the intended consequence is tied to collaboration. I think the primary unintended consequence is probably transparency within organizations that weren't aiming for it. And that can, I think, really change the way that organizations work together. Whereas historically there have been clear boundaries between departments and teams who don't work with each other, a lot of those end up being really broken down when an organization adopts a tool like Slack. And I think that can be quite disruptive for the way that organizations work. The idea that now, instead of having to reach out through the official channel, teams just start talking to each other. And I think that can have a lot of unintended consequences in the way people work together. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, have you guys ever heard stories of people getting really stressed out, leaving companies, or even worse things happening because they feel so stressed by having after-work communication or this constant need for real-time collaboration?
Not really, and no more than,
But do you think those things are happening if you haven't heard them?
I think just as much as under people using email and feeling stressed about that. The legislation that's happened in France is because people have felt that way just, with digital tools and not being able to disconnect. And I think that that's the rise of the cell phone and using a smartphone as part of your work.
Is there anything that you guys are trying to do to, to proactively prevent some of those negative consequences from happening with how Slack is used beyond just do not disturb?
Yeah, I think do not disturb and warning people about messaging large groups of people at any time is part of that.
How do you guys educate people on that, not to just blast people with messages at all hours?
Yeah, I think that there's both more kind of in and out of the app that we can do, in and out of the service. So, we provide, obviously, documentation for people using the service, but for larger companies, figure out how to, train people in the, norms and etiquette around Slack within their organization. Something which is, different from company to company. And the way in which different organizations use Slack is different and is reflective of their internal culture. So it's trying to provide the guidelines and support for each customer who's using it in a different way.
So one thing I think that you guys do that's really cool is you have this platform roadmap. Most big companies, they're building products and they don't necessarily tell anyone what's coming next. And when you run a platform of outside developers, you might sometimes step on top of what they're building. But Slack goes out there and says, hey, this is what we're building next. You might not want to build that because you're just going to end up competing with our own direct service. But at the same time, you have to balance that with competition. And you guys famously ran this full-page New York Times ad, welcoming Microsoft Teams, their Slack clone, to the revolution. So when you know you have these big competitors, how do you think about balancing transparency and competition?
I think that we can be transparent about what we're doing and still compete. It's no secret that we're building, a messaging platform for Teams. And I don't think we'll be successful by keeping our next set of features a secret, because the next set of features that we release, while important, are not the thing that's going to make us successful or not, like having a really high quality product is. In terms of the platform roadmap, I think that has been an important piece, being transparent around where our platform's going. I think what we've seen with other companies that have had, platform plays in the past, it's really easy to accidentally, end up encouraging people onto your platform and then competing with them in a way that's detrimental to the overall ecosystem health. So we want to be really careful that we're not encouraging people to build on Slack and then turning around and building that thing ourselves and being in competition with them.
Well, I'm really glad to hear that you're actually not getting too stressed. You're not working all night. That you guys are pushing for people to set healthy boundaries. but also, despite thinking that you guys of yourselves as just a tool, it's good to hear that you think that there's more you can do to educate your user base about how to make sure that the change, that revolution, as you guys advertised about moving towards transparency and this openness in workplace culture, doesn't necessarily mean you have to obliterate your life with it. So thank you very much for talking with us, Cal.
Thanks very much.